Welcome back to Frontline Macroanalysis TV. I'm your host, Remmy, and today we are unpacking one of the most underdiscussed, yet deeply consequential issues in global economics and history. How much wealth France stole from Africa, and why it still matters today. This isn't just about the past. It's about systems of exploitation that still affect African nations economically, politically, and socially. We'll go deep into the colonial economy, the infamous colonial tax, the CFA Franc system, and how France continues to benefit from African resources through multinational corporations, debt systems, and geopolitical control. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand that France's so-called post-colonial relationships with Africa were never about partnership. They were designed for perpetual extraction. 1. The historical context. Let's start at the beginning. France began its large-scale colonization of Africa in the late 19th century, during what was called the Scramble for Africa. At its peak, the French colonial empire controlled vast territories: Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, Congo-Brazzaville, Madagascar, Cameroon, and Benin, among others. By 1930, France ruled over more than 35% of Africa's landmass and exploited over 60 million Africans under its colonial system. The French colonial model was built on a philosophy called assimilation, claiming to bring civilization and modernity to Africa. But in reality, it was a machinery of economic theft. Colonial administrators imposed taxes that could only be paid in cash, forcing Africans to work in colonial plantations or mines to earn that money. France extracted raw materials: gold and diamonds from West Africa, uranium from Niger, cotton, cocoa, coffee, and timber from Equatorial Africa. The profits didn't stay in Africa. They flowed directly into French treasuries and French industry. 2. Forced labor and resource extraction. Under French rule, forced labor was a norm. Africans were compelled to build railways, roads, and plantations, not for local benefit, but to facilitate resource extraction. In French Equatorial Africa, a colonial report in 1925 estimated that more than 50% of workers on infrastructure projects died due to harsh conditions. In Niger, French companies extracted uranium for decades, uranium that powered French nuclear plants and weapons, while the local population remained impoverished and without electricity. One particularly stark example: France obtained uranium from the Arlit mines in Niger, a crucial resource that helped France become one of the world's leading nuclear powers. Yet, even today, more than 80% of Niger's citizens lack electricity. So who truly benefited? France. Who paid the price? AFR. ICA. 3. The colonial tax and economic control. When African nations began gaining independence in the late 1950s and 60s, France knew it could lose its economic dominance. So Paris crafted a clever trap: the Colonial Pact, also known as the colonial tax system. Under this arrangement, 14 African countries that gained independence were required to deposit up to 65% of their foreign currency reserves into the French Treasury, allow France to have first right of purchase on any natural resource discovered, use the CFA Franc, a currency controlled entirely by France. This effectively meant that these countries, such as Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Benin, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, and others, remained financially colonized. Even today, the CFA franc is pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French Treasury, meaning that African central banks cannot make independent monetary decisions. Imagine this: every time a country like Senegal wants to spend or invest, it must go through France's central bank mechanisms. That's not independence, that's financial dependency disguised as stability. The French reserve system, Africa's hidden vault in Paris. 14 African countries, mainly in West and Central Africa, still use a currency called the CFA franc, which stands for Communauté Financière Africaine, African Financial Community, in the West, and Coopération Financière en Afrique Centrale in the Central region. These include West Africa, UEMOA Bloc Senegal, Ivory Coast, Benin, Burkina Faso, Togo, Mali, Niger, and Guinea-Bissau. Central Africa, CEMAC Bloc Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. Here's what's shocking. Each of these countries must keep 50%, formerly 65%, of their foreign exchange reserves in a special operations account at the French Treasury in Paris. That means France holds the reserves that back the African currencies, not the African central banks themselves. The French Treasury invests those funds, earning interest for France when African nations want to use their own reserves for infrastructure, imports, or emergencies. They must request access from FR. In effect, Africa's money sits in France's vaults, and France profits from it. It's like keeping your savings in someone else's bank account, and they earn the interest while you get permission slips to spend. Economists estimate France benefits by billions of euros each year from these holdings alone. The CFA franc, the economic leash. The CFA franc is marketed as a stable currency because it's backed by the French Treasury. But stability comes with a cost: economic control. France has veto power over monetary policy decisions in African central banks, influence on exchange rate policy, making it hard for African countries to devalue or adjust their currency to favor exports. Authority to limit the amount of credit African countries can create, restricting development. This prevents industrial growth. Countries can't easily invest in factories, roads, or innovation without French oversight. In short, monetary sovereignty is gone, and with it, economic freedom. 4. Quantifying the theft. Now, let's talk numbers. Economists and historians estimate that between France's colonial era and the 21st century, the equivalent of trillions of dollars worth of wealth has been extracted from Africa. A 2016 report by French economist Ndongo Samba Sylla estimated that the colonial tax system alone has allowed France to access over $500 billion in African reserves since independence. Add to that profits from multinational companies like TotalEnergies, Areva, and Bolloré Group operating across Africa, revenues from African raw materials that feed France's manufacturing and energy sectors, and the interest and debt repayment structured under French-controlled development banks. It's not an exaggeration to say that modern France's economic stability has been built, and continues to depend, on African wealth. In essence, Africa still subsidizes France's prosperity. Every time a West African nation sells gold, uranium, or cocoa, part of that wealth flows into French banks before it ever reaches local budgets. Until African nations regain control of their reserves, currencies, and trade policy, the old colonial equation continues. Africa provides. France profits. The modern legacy. Let's move to today. While France no longer rules directly over African nations, Francafrique, the network of political, military, and business influence, still operates. French troops are stationed in several African countries, officially for security, but in practice, to protect French economic interests. When African leaders challenge this system, like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, or Mamadou Tanja of Niger, they often face political isolation, coups, or assassination. The 21st century also brought new resistance. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have recently expelled French troops and sought alliances with other partners such as Russia or China, signaling a breaking point with France's neocolonial model. But the CFA franc still stands. The French Treasury still holds African reserves. And French corporations still control logistics, ports, and energy sectors in many African states. This is what economists now call post-colonial extraction. France also structured trade relations with its former colonies to favor French industries. Fixed trade networks. French companies get preferential access to African markets. Many African countries are still required, by agreement or dependency, to times buy French products such as machinery, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods, times export raw materials, like cocoa, uranium, oil, and timber, to France at low or fixed prices. Manufactured dependency. Because the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, through the French Treasury, African exports become less competitive on global markets. Their goods are too expensive for other buyers, but convenient for France. Meanwhile, African imports from France remain cheap, flooding local markets and undercutting local industries. Example: times Ivory Coast exports cocoa beans to France. France processes them into chocolate and sells them back, often earning 10x more than the original export price. Times Niger exports uranium to France for nuclear energy. France sells electricity globally, while Niger's population remains among the poorest on Earth. Result: African nations stay trapped as raw material suppliers, while France reaps the profits from value-added industries. Tries. 6. Why it still matters. Today. So why should this matter to us today? Because Africa's underdevelopment cannot be understood without understanding how much was, and still is, taken out of it. France's wealth, infrastructure, and global influence were built on African labor, African gold, African uranium, and African land. The ongoing control of monetary policy and trade through the CFA franc continues to limit African nations' ability to industrialize and set their own development agenda. This is not just a historical grievance, it's an ongoing economic reality. It affects how African nations negotiate in global markets, attract investment, and create jobs. And until the financial and structural control mechanisms are dismantled, independence remains, in many ways, symbolic. Conclusion. So when we talk about reparations, debt cancellation, or true independence, we are not talking about charity. We are talking about justice. The story of how much wealth France stole from Africa is not only a moral issue, it's an economic one that shapes global inequality today. It's time to rethink the balance of power, to demand transparency, and to push for systems that allow African nations to control their own destinies. Thank you for watching Frontline Macroanalysis TV. If you found this enlightening, don't forget to subscribe, share, and join the conversation in the comments below. Because understanding history is the first step toward changing future. Africa provides. France profits. Together.